Okay, so thanks everybody for coming to this session. As you've seen, my name's Keith Quinn. I'm the Learning and Development Manager for Digital Learning at the SSC, which is the Scottish Social Services Council. And I was asked to speak about my kind of thoughts on a year of disruption for learning and development, but I also want to take some time to look ahead to the future and what the potential is for that. So, like everyone else, the impact of the pandemic on our work was sudden, significant, and it touched almost everything we do. But that was true of almost every other aspect of life. So, in terms of workforce development in the sector, what we saw was the immediate suspension of in-person events. We saw a hasty pivot from training centres and classrooms to online. And we also had a high number of requests for support, practical advice to help people manage that transition. We also were pressed into providing additional supports for the sector. So we wanted to respond to staff redeployment, the active engagement of volunteers and former care staff returning to the sector. So we created guidance on minimum competence checks and minimum learning requirements for the sector, amongst a whole range of other things. And we produced guidance on a massive range of issues, including about how to engage online and how to find safe information and so on. But of course, there were parts of the sector that were furloughed, particularly around early education and childcare. And what furlough meant for us was that staff suddenly had time available which they were using for learning and development. And so for my team, the digital learning team at SSC, we added 9,000 plus new learners to our open badge platform between mid-March and June. And I think the whole of the previous year, we'd added something like 4,500 or 5,000 learners. So 2.5 months to double that was quite significant. And applications for open badges rose from an average of 500 a month to 4,500 a month. So I think that's kind of proof positive that the biggest barrier for learning in the sector is, and always has been, time. But it did put a significant strain on the limited staff resources that we have in the digital learning team. And of course, there were immediate impacts on practice-based learning arrangements. So when the pandemic lockdown restrictions were imposed, all student placements were suspended across Scotland, and we had to draft guidance for social work placements, for the degree in social work, for HNC placements, and obviously there were implications for the assessment of practice for SVQs as well. And SSC worked with its partners and stakeholders to draw up further advice on that as well. But people were now also more open to considering some creative solutions to remote assessment of practice, systems like video enhanced observation, which continues to get traction given the ongoing situation we're in. So those were the immediate things for us. And in May and June this year, we contacted a number of people that are part of our learning and development network, both here in Scotland but across the world, to speak to them about what their experience had been since the pandemic had made itself felt, and about their views on what the future might hold for learning and development. And I thought that you might find their comments interesting. So I'm going to start with higher education in Scotland.
Yeah, it's probably like everybody else. It's just been very intense, I think. I think we spotted kind of probably late January, we had some teaching that was due to be delivered in China in April and then in May. So we were very quickly working with the academics who wouldn't be able to travel to China to try and help them begin to think about how they would deliver their programs fully online. I think from that initial work, we as a team were beginning to think this is going to impact us here, and before too long we are going to be in lockdown.
Yeah.
I think as a team, what we started to do was to think when certain things happen, we need to be kind of ready.
Right.
And I think there was a sense in which that maybe we were thinking a little bit ahead of the curve. So there was a bit of frustration, I think, with maybe what was happening. So it's been intense. And I guess the key things for us have been particularly around how do you deliver an exam diet.
Right.
So we do online exams at Dundee already, but it was the fact that all exams were going to go online.
Yeah.
So it's really developing a whole new service. Yeah, I think once lecturers start to deliver blended learning, and actually, I think it's that thing of, isn't it? It's moving away from the lecture and the PowerPoint. So I think it's this thing about moving to more activities, and it's the of the teacher away from just the information giver to one who wants to develop the learner into a community of practice, develop their critical thinking skills, and to kind of, I suppose, ultimately see their students as individuals who will become agents of change in the wider world.
Gosh, it's been a long 9 weeks, and the impact on the team and what's happened at the university and to us has changed dramatically in that time. The initial feeling, which I think was shared by most of the population, was one of anxiety and a need to do something. And lots of people did that in different ways, but because there was this immediate pivot to online learning, and for us, it was just coming up to assessment time. So it was very focused on, actually, we can't do face-to-face exams. What can we do very, very quickly, working with quality and the schools to ensure that assessment is online and is fair and doesn't disadvantage any students. So there was an immediate need for, first of all, providing some support for that very quick pivot for the last bit of learning and teaching. And then there was support required for the changing of assessment. So whatever we do next really has to be of an excellent standard, really high quality online learning, so that we're not disadvantaging a cohort of a broad cohort intake of students who, we don't want them to be considered the coronavirus cohort that didn't have the same standard of education as other students.
And I'd like to move on and give you some clips from some of our international network. And I'm going to start with David Kelly, who's the Executive Director of the Learning Guild in the USA.
But I think what we're going through parallels what a lot of organizations are going through, in the sense that two aspects I think will be helpful to people. One is that we just have to deal with the reality of what the pandemic is doing in terms of its effect on travel, its effect on people's ability to gather and learn from one another in what is a traditional environment. But I think the bigger issue that we're dealing with now, and organizations in general need to look at, is I think we were all caught off guard in the early portion of the year. I mean, even us, we knew that what was going on in China, we knew that there was a possibility that this could go. We were talking about the warnings of pandemic, but I think everyone was just kind of like, oh, that we have to track that thing that's going on over there. But it came to the United States, at least, so suddenly and so rapidly. I think that's the thing that caught everyone off guard, is how quickly this exploded. That we really weren't as prepared as maybe we should be to pivot what we had scheduled in March. We had to cancel it, but we really weren't fully prepared. We were, for lack of a better term, caught with our pants down, of just not being ready to deal with this. And I think that there were a lot of organizations in that space. But there's no excuse for that going forward. Like, we have events scheduled for November, like our DevLearn conference this year in October. There's no reason for us to be, there's no excuse for us to be caught off guard by this. No one knows what the future is going to hold. We're anticipating being able to gather in person in an adapted way, and we're prepared for that. But we may not be able to. And if so, we need to be able to provide people with the same sort of experience, the same learning opportunities in a virtual environment. And we're building the infrastructure for that as well. I think that there's pluses and minuses. I'm concerned that the shift to the phrase that I've heard used most often that resonates with me, the shift to emergency remote teaching, which is a phrase that I tend to think is the most accurate in terms of what a lot of what's going on, is not going to set an expectation for what online learning is. There's a very different definition between emergency remote teaching and online learning. One is a subset of the other, but they're not the same terms in any way. And I'm hoping that people recognize that, because if a lot of people are being exposed to online learning for the first time through this experience, my kids being a great example, that they had to shift from school, from face-to-face school to online learning. And there's a very different implementation there between emergency remote teaching and what online learning could be. And I'm hoping that we don't have a culture that defines what online learning is based on the mass adoption of emergency remote teaching. We have to be prepared to do that, to take the moment that we're in where everyone is going through this emergency remote teaching and say, all right, now that things are calm, how can we do this better? How can we be prepared for the next time that we have to do this, to do it more effectively?
The first while was being creative around helping people understand there's still ways of collaborating. And yes, leadership, it looks differently, but here's some resources to help you make sure that you're staying connected. Learning and development, we're busier than ever trying to pivot quickly as the organization's needs change. But then we've had other departments that have had interesting pivots. So we put in a hiring freeze because of COVID. And so our talent acquisition team is not working heavily on hiring for the organization, but we've pivoted to help our partners. So long-term care homes right now are having a very difficult time finding PSWs. So what our talent acquisition team has been doing is, they've been trying to help do the hiring. So they've been, calling, and then we've been partnering with local colleges to say, okay, how can we help you skill up your PSW students, make sure that they're ready, because our platform is in over 90% of the homes. It's like, how can we help you skill them up? We can give you the access to a sandbox. We can give you access to our training materials, but we want to help you get more PSWs into the field. So they might not be doing the work that they were originally doing, but now everybody's doing what our CEO calls the sharpen the saw stuff, that stuff that you might have liked to have gotten to, but didn't have time before. And now that's where you're putting all your focus. From our viewpoint, we're actually looking literally right now at how we are going to evolve, because there are a number of things that we are anticipating we will no longer be able to do the way that we did them before. When I talk about the culture immersion program, there's no time in the near future that I see any long-term care home allowing groups of people. There's no way, they just can't, for the safety of their residents. They can't let a group like that come tracing through the home. How do we still provide that same experience, because we think it's fundamentally important? Yeah. And so I think now learning is having to adapt and look at, more than ever before, how can we leverage the technology and innovation that's out there? So I know for us right now, we're saying, okay, so maybe we can't have 8 people through, but can we have one person that is very aware of the environment, that, you put in whatever PPE that they need to be in, and they go in and create a 360 tour. Yeah. And so that's what we're looking at right now is, we're not changing the what, we're changing the how.
What we've seen, the impact is different in different industries, of course. Some are hit worse than others. And we see that, for example, aviation is 90% of operations have been suspended
Yeah.
globally. It means that it's a nearly total stop. But training demands don't disappear, even though people are not working in many companies at the moment. But the companies already need to consider how they sustain operations and what is needed. So it means that we had to come up with quick solutions to train on topics that didn't appear before the crisis. I would assume that some companies are not even aware what's going to happen in the next 3 months' time.
Yeah.
The change is so big, and we're going to see a lot of changes, and many of these impact training departments. So you need to be ready for coming up with new kind of ways, not only substance-wise, but also the methods will change. So now we are doing different kinds of solutions that are probably more suited for the tomorrow's need. Yeah. When operations really start again and people return to workplaces and so forth. Definitely the change will be permanent. I mean, people have seen how it's possible to work from distance, yeah, to train yourself from distance, and these experiences don't disappear. So we've learned a lot, and we're going to see an interesting future in training. It's interesting to see that we've had a number of ideas about new concepts for online learning in the past, and some of these are becoming really useful now, and we see that they get traction because you have to come up with new ways. You don't have that old way available anymore.
Almost everybody I've been speaking to has been affected, and it's had repercussions on my work for the longer term. So planning conferences, well, we had to cancel the June conference physically, we'll be doing it online. But then the question comes, well, what do you do about events maybe in September, later on in the year, and even learning technologies in February next year? And so for all of these, we are planning quite carefully what we do if it's according to a range of scenarios, from everything's as it was right through to everything has to take place online. Yeah. So the short term, strangely unaffected, but it's certainly affecting long-term planning. Whatever you are doing in terms of physical meetings, if you're pulling together people in the future for a physical meeting, and especially for a conference, you're going to have to prove the value of it in a way that you never had to in the past. So you're just going to have to do much better stuff. The emphasis is on all of us to do much better work. In terms of how learning and development is going to be affected in the future, I think what's happened, or what will have happened by the time we come out of this, is that we'll have gone through a prolonged period of several months where everybody that has had a similar experience. And we've been forced to do things differently. So what's looked like it was impossible in January becomes routine by April. And in particular, I'm thinking about all the stuff we've been doing online. Meeting together online, brainstorming, chatting, having even social events online, quizzes and so on. This is now stuff that it's been a massive and not always easy learning curve, but it has happened. It's going to be very difficult going back from where we are now to where we were before we were locked down. We are going to shift as a result from a world where things take place in the real world to a place where we ask why things shouldn't take place digitally first. So what I call the digital by default world. That doesn't mean the digital way is the right way of doing it. It just means that we know we can do it digitally. And whereas in the past we've had to make a case for doing things online very often, my belief is that when we come out of this, very often we'll have to make a case for doing it in the physical world.
So those clips were all excerpts from 3 podcast episodes that we published earlier this year. And there were more speakers than the 6 that you've seen, or heard rather. And if you'd like to hear more about these full interviews, you can follow up on Apple Podcasts or Spotify by searching for Learncast by SSC Digital Learning. There's a lot more material there, but I thought the comments made by these 6 people were really relevant to our situation. So I attended DevLearn recently, a big international conference, and one of the presenters used this chart rather, produced by Gartner, as a way of visualizing the process we're all engaged in at the moment. And it was about the process of responding to unexpected change for business. But I've adapted it for learning and development and what our responses might be. So the first part of that was about responding. As I've mentioned, when the pandemic hit, everything changed overnight. And in learning and development terms, that meant us taking immediate action to move everything that we need online. And often that meant making use of generic available tools in the organisation, like Microsoft Teams, regardless of whether or not they are actually fit for purpose. But while we're in the midst of that, it also became clear that the lockdown restrictions on in-person gatherings were going to be with us for some time. So in our situation, this has meant that we've also had to create a plan to move core learning programs online, and the restart of these programs, these learning and development programs. And looking to the longer term, we need to think about what comes next. So for that, translates to us in terms of using learning, feedback and experience from these previous phases to inform that new approach. And we need a new ongoing strategic and sustainable delivery method across the organisation and across the sector. But what you'll notice for that chart is, of course, that here is that these phases aren't sequential. They don't follow one neatly after the other. They overlap. So you're having to kind of do all 3 of these processes at the same time. But I just want to kind of take a minute now to think about some of the implications of crisis. So as we know only too well, crisis is disruptive, and it can and most often does have distressing and devastating consequences, regardless of whether it's conflict, natural disaster, a humanitarian crisis, financial crash, or as we're currently experiencing, a global health crisis. But crisis also forces us to re-examine established practices and norms, and it can accelerate change. So when you're dealing with major crisis, one of the things that happens is that problem-solving skills move to the forefront. People are always trying to find novel solutions quickly, and so with the problem-solving skills, creativity becomes premium, because as you've heard these speakers say, what we had before is no longer available to us, so what do we create to put in its place? It's also common that the pace of technology development increases rapidly as well. And in the midst of this pandemic, you've still seen the major tech companies roll out not only new hardware and software, but new services. And back at the beginning of the pandemic, things like Microsoft Teams and Zoom were fairly basic tools, but both Microsoft and Zoom have made great strides in making these platforms more functional. And when it comes to technology, attitudes to technology and acceptance of technology has changed. Certainly in the social services sector, where people now kind of recognise that it needs to form part of the way that they deliver service. And in every crisis, major crisis the world's experienced, practice has developed, regardless of what sector you're working in. And we've seen integration of learning with workflow, because you need to learn the new things at the point of need. When do you need to learn it? You need to learn it right now, so you're learning and applying that at the same time. But I saw a speaker recently at a Learning Leaders Conference called Vidya Krishnan, and she's the Global Chief Learning Officer for Ericsson Telecommunications, and she made a really, really interesting comment. What she said was the future's unpredictable but not accidental. So what does that mean for us? Well, for me, the key message in that quote is that we all have agency. The future doesn't have to just happen to us. We can, and I would argue we should, take an active role in shaping what that future looks like. So beyond the pandemic, what do we think business as usual is going to look like? Well, it's quite clear that, as you heard Don Taylor and others saying, online as a core offering is here to stay. In the terms of how we go about our business, how we learn, but also I think we're going to see new approaches to assessment being adopted. Learning will most definitely be a blend, but getting that blend right will be vital. We can't rely on just pushing content to learners, and the focus really has to shift from simplistic attendance type analytics to more sophisticated measurement of impact of learning on practice. And if you want to hear more about that, I'm running a session, I think it's on the 7th of December, about how you know you're making a difference with learning. And effective learning will be delivered in the flow of work more and more as we move forward. We really, really have to move beyond compliance learning. We must engage with learners and provide compelling learning experiences which go beyond an information dump. We have to provide experiences to support people to develop their knowledge, skills, and capabilities, and to incentivize and reward application of learning to practice. And allied to that, learner self-management is going to be vital. We're all aware, certainly in social services, of the reduction of sector-specific learning and development resource, whether that's people or time or money. And this will impact not only on learning delivery, but on the availability of guidance for learners. And that's why in the digital learning team at the SSC, we've been so focused on adopting a learner-centric approach for the last several years. And what we've shown through that experience is that where you give learners control and ownership of their own learning, it boosts their commitment to it. And then what starts to happen is that people start learning, not because of being told to learn something, but because they want to learn. And I think in terms of continuing professional learning and lifelong learning, that's going to be vital moving forward. But we need to give people the tools to do that. And we just recently launched a new app called My Learning, which is, you'll see an advert at the end of this for that. And that allows people to manage their own learning. So, I mentioned we need to harness creativity and innovation and the potential of new technologies. So what will that look like? Well, first up, I think we're going to see a move to learning experience platforms. At the moment, most organizations are using learning management systems, but I think they're going to be superseded by more learner-centric learning ecosystems and distributed learning experience platforms. So just to kind of explain that a wee bit, learning management systems provide basic e-learning storage and presentation tools, and they do all the kind of course administration and reporting functions. But they were designed for the needs of the world 20 to 30 years ago. Learning experience platforms provide additional benefits, including curation and signposting of not only the material that you develop for your staff, but also of external content. They allow for the integration of skills mapping and the development of personalised learning pathways. and they support provide support for discovery learning and self-directed learning. And there are a number of these platforms available now, and I think their use is really going to grow. We're going to see augmented reality becoming a mainstream tool for learning. So, for example, whereas at the moment things like moving and handling might be done in classrooms, with the trainer observing your actions and giving you comments, in the future that's more likely to be about an augmented reality app where they're watching a video of you and then being able to annotate that video and literally drawn on top of the video to show you where you're getting things right or maybe need to change your practice. But we're also going to start to see it to help people learn how to use assistive technology and to do tasks like learning about how to create dementia-friendly living environments and so on. And we're also going to start to see the mainstreaming of virtual reality. Stanford have got a lot of research on using VR for learning, and and what they've got several projects that have shown that immersing people in virtual reality experiences can greatly boost empathy. And in fact, one of the buzz terms around learning development at the moment is about VR being an empathy engine. But we can also use it to put learners in challenging practice opportunities to learn. So at the moment, social work students are not allowed to lead a child protection investigation or do a mental health assessment. But in virtual reality, you can create circumstances where they can actually do that. And we're working on a project at the moment called Be Me, which is aimed at new starts in the sector and brand new HNC level students. And it puts the learner inside the body of somebody receiving a service to let them see what it's like. So it takes that whole kind of user-centered practice exercise and makes it deeply personal. The other big change that's coming at us is 5G. 5G is going to really drive rapid change. And when I was at Vidya's session at the Learning Leaders Conference, obviously being part of a telecommunications company, she was focusing on the impact of 5G, not only on how folk are going to learn, but on how we're going to live. But for learning, VR is really going to intensify the learning experiences in future. So classroom-based content will become immersion-based content. And what we're talking about there is live virtual reality experiences and shared virtual reality experiences. So there'll be other learners in the same virtual environment as you. Trainer control is going to give way to learner choice, as I've kind of already suggested. So that whole kind of sage on the stage thing will become guide by your side, rather, as a completely different approach. And show and tell will become do and discover. And I think a combination of 5G and artificial intelligence is also going to make sure that one size fits all gives way to one size fits you. And 5G is going to bring some truly disruptive technologies. So things like virtual presence. The technology already exists to put you in an environment where you're sitting around a table at a meeting, but everybody around that table is in a different country, and it'll feel like you're in the same room. The Internet of Things will rapidly connect everything around us, and it will enable the development of smart, adaptive living environments, which for care and care at home is going to be a sea change. And the amount of data that generates is going to allow for the development of truly personal digital assistants. But there are also challenges. First up is investment. Finance is going to be needed to achieve sustainable change, not just in infrastructure or hardware, but most importantly in the workforce. And that's not just about general digital capabilities, but we're going to have to invest in the learning and development personnel who we need to design the learning experiences of the future. We need to get folk to move past the information dump and start thinking about learning experiences. So we're going to need courageous leadership. Wicked problems need creative solutions. And organisational and professional leadership will need to make some pretty brave decisions to promote innovation. It's a well-established fact that 2/3 of innovations fail. But the key here is not to get into blame, but to learn. And there's a famous quote by Thomas Watson, who was the founder at IBM, who said, "The way to succeed is to double your failure rate." And the key thing is you learn for each iteration. But permission to innovate is going to be essential. And co-design will have a role to play, but it can't be the only approach. So what do I mean by that? Well, when launching the first motor car, Henry Ford is quoted as saying, if we asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And so if you rely totally on co-design, people just look at polishing a better version of what they've got. We need to imagine solutions that the wider workforce and the general public can't even conceive about yet. And finally, we need integrated approaches. All parts of the system need to work together. And that means that some people are going to have to let go of some sacred cows and support innovation rather than block it. And folk who know me that one of my pet peeves is when you want to do something new or different, the first block is getting past the IT department with a response of, oh, you can't do that. Well, that response of you can't do that needs to change to how can we help you do that? So I want to take you back to this chart I showed you earlier. So by now, we should all be moving beyond the delivery emergency responses and should be clearly focusing on recovery and the renewal stages. I'd suggest we should think about what I've just sketched out regarding the possibilities for the future of workforce development and listen to the potential in that quote from Vijay Krishnan. So rather than seeing it as a question of how do we get back to where we were, I'd like to suggest that it's really a question about where do we want to be in the future and how are we going to get there. And I'm going to leave you with this quote from George Westerman from MIT. I really love this. When digital transformation is done right, it's like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. But when done wrong, all you have is a really fast caterpillar. So I suppose the real final question is, what is it that you want to create? Butterflies or really fast caterpillars? If you want to follow up on any of the things I've mentioned, you can contact me at the SSSC, and also would highlight the Open Badge platform and our new My Learning service. I encourage you to have a look at that. So if you've got any questions, I am happy to take those. So I'm going to switch the camera back on.
Hi Keith, it's Nessa here. Is it all?
Hi Nessa.
I asked the first question.
Of course.
I was interested in what you were saying about the blended approach, Keith, and moving towards it, just accepting a blended approach. And we hear very much a parallel to that in health and care delivery using digital tools. We have to think about blended approaches. And my question, I'm not sure if we have an answer for this at this stage. My question is, how do you get the blend? Is it a case of keep trying things to see what works? Or how do you know when the blend or the balance is right?
Well, I mean, I think that our approach in the digital learning team is to follow the evidence and look at the research evidence. So everything that we do is based on what does research tell us is effective? So we don't do things because we like bright, shiny things or because something's cool. Those might be factors after the event, but what we're interested in is, does the underlying approach work? So when it comes to blend, what we know from educational research is educational research, if you look at the work on situated learning and situated cognition, that basically the punchline is, if you learn something in the environment in which it's going to be used, learning transfer is more effective and it's more likely to stick. So that means you need to look fundamentally at your learning designs for digital learning. So you can't expect somebody to sit in front of a screen and that will be the be-all and end-all of the learning experience. So what we do is we break learning up, but we include activities that basically follow the acquire, apply, reflect, record kind of cycle. So you've just learned this, now go into the workplace and do X, Y, and Z. When you've done that task, think about that experience, and here are some questions to guide you, and then record that and discuss it, preferably with a mentor, supervisor, line manager, whoever that is. So, when you get into blend, you need to build blend into the whole experience. So that's why we never use the term e-learning in my team, and except to point out that that's not what we do. We talk about digital learning because it's a shorter way of saying technology enhanced learning. You know, that's quite a mouthful. And what we mean is learning experiences have to be a blend between various technologies to get the job done. And bear in mind that technology might be pen and paper.
Excellent. Just to pick up on that point, comment from Sophie. He also mentions the Let's Get On With It, which is a very specific Scottish resource. Sorry, Keith, is that better?
You must.
Okay, sorry, folks. So just to pick up on that point, we had a comment from Sodi who mentions the Let's Get On With It Scottish resource for self-management training, which is pivoted also during this time. And he's picking up on the question I asked you about blended learning. And he said you need to ask the users what they want, of course. A full training needs analysis is needed from which the information results should tell you what to develop and how to deliver. And we had 2 or 3 comments or questions from Leonardo. Hi, Leonardo. So I'll just, if you bear with me, I'll just start at the top. Because I had asked the delegates watching, Keith, about their own experiences. So Leonardo had kindly chipped in to say that they had developed a one-stop training portal for their staff to make training and education available during that transition from face-to-face to virtual activities that you were speaking about, Keith. And he said it had been very effective and the staff can access the resources at the most convenient time, which again is a point that you would stress, I would say, Keith, about convenience for the learner. And then Leonardo had noted that they have now upgraded it to integrate the links and the training from other organizations for the staff, and they've just updated it with the latest courses. So aside from the usual training that they are delivering virtually, but he does ask, he says, we are struggling on how we can manage virtually the training that needs a hands-on or step-by-step procedure. What learning platform do you think has been the most suitable? Thanks, Keith.
There are various ways you can tackle that one. I mean, obviously there's the kind of demonstration stuff and the demonstrating processes. There's interactive video that you can develop that does some of that stuff. But there's no doubt, I mean, I've seen some applications using augmented reality. I saw one last week which was actually recreating laboratory-based learning completely in augmented reality. So people can't be in lab-type classes at the moment, but they can have the same experience at home using a virtual microscope, for example. But there are a range of augmented reality tools beginning to appear where the augmented reality, for people who haven't quite experienced it yet, overlays digital content on the real world. So there are a number of applications where you can be shown how to do something at the point at which you're doing it, just by using augmented reality, where it superimposes the steps on the world that you're actually looking at, and it tells you what to do next. And so there's a lot of these things starting to emerge. I mean, the one comment I would have about one-stop shops is be wary of that. We deliberately don't expect everybody to use our learning zone. We work on an ecosystem model rather than a centralized platform model, because one of the things that we think is going to be a fundamental thing in the future is about people developing the tacit skills, the tacit knowledge of how to survive online. Now, we've got a huge spectrum of ability in our workforce. Some people who are very digitally savvy, some people who are at the complete opposite end for that. The problem with one-stop shops is that people learn how to use that platform. And if that platform goes away for whatever reason, they're lost. So we know that for people using a kind of networked approach, it's a steeper learning curve, but ultimately it's that tacit learning that's going to equip them about how to live, work, and learn online in the future. But sorry, jumping back to the original point about practical tasks, I would encourage Leonardo to look at interactive video. We've seen some stuff in interactive video that's really promising, where you can provide options for people to test things out. The other thing that you can do is there's a number of not only online services, but there's potential to develop. You heard Cindy Plunkett talking about 360 tours, which is 360-degree either visuals, whether that be video or still images, that you can then overlay a user interface that displays content when you look at it or when you interact with it. That's also, I mean, those kind of using static imagery, they can be really, really effective.
Okay, thank you, Keith. We had a question for you, really, about your experience from Katie. She said it's been really interesting, Keith. What type of learner are you, and how has that changed during your career and studying and learning?
Insatiable, I would say. I'm that kind of, I'm a hungry learner. You can probably tell the way I'm built. I used to be someone who learned to get through certifications, right? So I'm really good at getting bits of paper. You know, I've got, you know, as well as my undergrad, I've got 2 master's degrees and so on. So I'm good at that kind of stuff. But where I have changed over the years is I've been a lot more interested in discovery type learning. So I love going to events where there are people who have got nothing to do with social services or healthcare. And you saw Timu Patala from Finland there. Timu's background is in aviation, but I've learned so much from him, and I've got some ideas from him that you think, oh, I could use that in social services, or I could use that concept. So I suppose I'm a big discovery learner, and I like you know, thinking a wee bit that way rather than that way. So always on the lookout for a new idea. And one of my favourite things is when you see a new technology that's not really designed for learning, and then having that wee light bulb moment of, oh, I could use that to do whatever.
Thank you, Keith. Very honest. Yeah, I think you're a living example of knowledge translation in action. And in a way, that's what we try to do at this event, is bring people from lots of different sectors and perspectives together. Because I think that's just much more interesting than only speaking to people who come from the same working environment as you do.
Yeah, because it becomes an echo chamber. You know, I mean, if you're only ever talking to people in your corner of the world, it does become that echo chamber where people kind of go, yes, 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 we're all right, this is how we do it. And it's refreshing to go out into another sector where people go, why did you do that? Why haven't you done this instead? And that's where the creativity comes from. That's where that kind of blend of different ideas for different circumstances, and then looking at how might that translate to what we're trying to achieve.
Just checking the chat, Keith, we're nearly at the end, but I have a point here from Julie. So Julie's asked, well, she said, thank you, Keith. I'm looking to set up virtual learning to supplement our VLE content. So we'll be in touch with you if that's okay. Yep. And I think, going by my rough knowledge of Scottish geography, that Julie is in the Western Isles. Julie, I hope that's right. Sorry if it's not. And Carol has also put a comment in to say it's refreshing to your colleagues consider how we really understand what users need to achieve their goals, which we don't always achieve by asking what people want or co-design. Understanding needs helps us to be more innovative in potential solutions, similar to Keith's faster running horse analogy. Yeah, I'm not going to get the horses or the butterflies out of my mind for a while.
I mean, I suppose if there was one thing I would want folk to take away for this, about our approach, it's please don't ever underestimate the massive power of giving learners ownership of their learning. We've seen things with our open badge system that have left us almost speechless. When you give people the control and give them ownership of their learning, what you're really doing is what happens is, because they take over, you can stand on the sidelines and gently nudge. You no longer have to drag people kicking and screaming to do learning. Because our experience is, when you start to mandate things and you shovel compliance learning at people, that's when they switch off. Switch them back on, make them curious, incentivize the learning, and hand it over to them and let them run with it, because you'll be surprised at the result.
Keith, that's a really good point for us to come to a close, I think. It also echoes the points made earlier today. Particularly, I'm thinking of the conversation which Donald McCaskill, the Chief Exec from Scottish Care, and some of the other panel members were making about citizen control and citizen empowerment when it comes to digital health and care technologies. And we're all citizens and we're all people, and we all have to use technology. So I think it's a very interesting point to come to. I have one last, hopefully quick question, if I can be cheeky. And that is, I mean, you mentioned about the absolute appetite for the open badges. I've put the link for open badges or more information about it into the chat as well. But I just wondered, is there anything that's, when you think of it now, that comes up in your mind for the past year that's really surprised you or shocked you even?
I think the real surprise was just how quickly the work that we were doing exploded after the pandemic hit. And I mean, it got absolutely insane almost overnight. But I think it was a shock, but it was a pleasant shock that people, when given the opportunity, grabbed learning and went with it. I mean, and I think that's been the biggest thing for me is that experience, when people were able to fully engage, it actually opened up their horizons about what they were prepared to do if we pointed them in a direction. So I think it's that kind of almost self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, it's like you give folk an opportunity, and if they run with it, they're going to, it's going to develop a momentum of its own. And that's kind of what we saw happen. And it was a real kind of eye-opener for us. I mean, exhausting, but because every badge application is looked at by a real person, it's not done automatically. And it was absolutely exhausting, but it was great to see those numbers of people coming to learn and recognizing that, well, let's use this time productively.
A great point to finish on. I will just say thank you very much, Keith, for sharing your insights of this past year and how we start to think about, obviously, the serious challenges that are placed on all of our services and our learning and development providers, but also how we try to turn some of this into an opportunity to deliver things in different ways and maybe more bespoke or person-centered ways as well. So thank you very much, Keith. That's been great. And thank you to everybody who joined the session and put their chat and questions in as well. And we'll see you again.
Yep.
Bye.
Thanks, folks, for putting up with it.